On August 14, 2005, a strange and terrifying guest was hovering in the skies above Athens, the capital of Greece. A passenger plane was flying more than 10,000 meters above the ground without contacting anyone. What made it even more frightening was that for the past 2 hours, the plane had not responded to any messages from the control tower. Fear spread throughout Athens. People wondered if it was a terrorist attack or a hijacking incident. Because of this fear, the Greek Air Force immediately sent fighter jets after the aircraft. When the fighter jets got close to the plane, they witnessed a scene that shocked them completely. It turned out there was complete silence inside the aircraft. There was no movement at all. All the passengers were sitting lifelessly in their seats and no one was inside the cockpit. Meanwhile, the pilots of the F-16 jets noticed a man inside the cockpit who clearly did not look like a pilot. He was moving around the cockpit as if he were searching for something or trying to understand something. In the next moment, the plane suddenly tilted to one side and rapidly descended toward the ground. A few minutes later, it crashed into mountains north of Athens. In this accident, all 121 passengers and crew members lost their lives. But what exactly happened? Why was there no movement inside the plane? Why were the pilots and crew members not responding to any calls? And what happened after takeoff that eventually caused such a horrifying disaster? This is the story of Helios Flight 522, also known as the Ghost Plane. Welcome back to Scope History Videos. On the morning of August 14, 2005, 115 passengers and 6 crew members boarded Helios Flight 522 at Larnaca Airport in Cyprus. Their destination was Prague, a city in the Czech Republic, but they were scheduled to stop in Athens on the way. It was summertime, and most of the passengers were traveling from Cyprus for vacation. The flight was expected to land in Athens before continuing onward. The captain of this flight was highly experienced. At 59 years old, he had more than 17,000 hours of flying experience. The first officer was also experienced at the age of 51, with over 7,500 flight hours. Usually accidents like this highlight the crew's expertise, but in this case, the story was a little different. These two pilots had worked together on several flights before. The first officer often complained to his friends and family about the captain's pressure and strict attitude. The airline was already aware of this issue. Not only that, but the first officer's training record also showed that he struggled with checklist procedures. This would later become extremely important. The aircraft was a 7-year-old Boeing 737-300. In the cool morning air, the plane took off from Larnaca Airport without any problems. As soon as the aircraft climbed above 10,000 feet, the crew contacted Nicosia Air Traffic Control and requested permission to climb to 34,000 feet. Permission was granted, but as soon as the plane reached 12,000 feet, an alarm began sounding inside the cockpit. This alarm was usually heard on the ground before takeoff whenever there was a problem with the aircraft's takeoff configuration. That is why both pilots were surprised to hear it while airborne. After 90 seconds, the captain contacted the airline's operations center and informed them about the takeoff configuration warning. He also mentioned that the ventilation cooling fan lights were off and asked where the circuit breakers were located. The engineer on the ground replied that the lights were supposed to be off anyway. He also explained that the circuit breaker was located behind the captain's seat. When the engineer asked the captain to confirm the issue, the captain replied that it was not off. The engineer did not understand the pilot's response at all. Meanwhile, the engineer remembered something important. Before the flight, he had checked the aircraft's pressurization system. The controls for that system were located close to the controls the captain was asking about. Because of this, the engineer asked the captain whether the pressurization mode was set to auto or manual. But instead of answering the question, the captain repeated his own question again. Where are the circuit breakers? During this conversation, the oxygen masks inside the passenger cabin had already dropped down. A short while later, communication between the aircraft and Helios ground operations was lost. As soon as the aircraft reached 34,000 feet, all attempts to contact it became unsuccessful. Helios operations then contacted Nicosia Air Traffic Control and requested them to try reaching Flight 522. For the next 5 minutes, the controller repeatedly attempted to contact the plane, but there was no response. The controller then contacted another aircraft flying near Flight 522 and asked them to attempt communication as well. But this attempt also failed. Meanwhile, Flight 522 entered Greek airspace without permission. It continued flying according to its programmed flight plan. Nicosia Air Traffic Control also attempted to contact Flight 522 using the emergency frequency, but there was still no response. They then contacted Athens Air Traffic Control in Greece and asked whether they had managed to reach Flight 522. Unfortunately, Athens ATC also received no response from the aircraft. At this point, there were two possible explanations. Either there was a problem with Flight 522's radio transmission system, meaning the pilots could hear messages but could not transmit replies, or both pilots had been taken hostage. Keeping the first possibility in mind, Athens ATC allowed the aircraft to begin its descent. But Flight 522 showed no sign of descending. Even after more than 20 contact attempts, there was still no response. Athens ATC then contacted the Greek Air Force and informed them that Flight 522 had entered the airspace without permission and was not responding to any communications. The Greek Air Force immediately dispatched two F-16 fighter jets to intercept the aircraft. Until then, Flight 522 was perfectly following its flight path on autopilot. The point where it was supposed to descend had already been passed twice, yet the aircraft continued flying at 34,000 feet. At 7:37 in the morning, Flight 522 entered a holding pattern above Athens Airport. A holding pattern is when an aircraft circles above an airport while waiting for permission to land. As soon as clearance is given, the aircraft begins its landing approach. When the plane was completing its sixth holding pattern, both F-16 fighter jets intercepted it. It was exactly 8:30 in the morning. One of the F-16 pilots reported something extremely shocking. He stated that the captain's seat inside the cockpit of Flight 522 was empty. He also looked inside the passenger cabin. Through the sunlight coming from the opposite windows, he could clearly see the cabin interior. The passengers were sitting motionless in their seats with oxygen masks covering their faces. During the aircraft's 10th holding pattern, one of the F-16 pilots witnessed a strange scene. A man wearing a light blue shirt and a black vest entered the cockpit and sat in the captain's seat. He put on headphones and placed his hands on the control panel in front of him. The fighter pilots gestured toward the man in the cockpit, and he waved back in response. But moments later, the aircraft's left engine stopped working. The plane sharply tilted to the left and began descending rapidly toward the ground. Shortly before 9 a.m., the plane tilted even further to the left, and then the right engine also failed. About 4 minutes later, the aircraft crashed into mountains northwest of Athens and was completely destroyed. Immediately after the crash, investigators began their work. They examined the wreckage and questioned the engineer who had performed maintenance on the aircraft before the incident. The night before the flight, the same engineer had conducted a pressurization leak test on the aircraft. During this test, he switched the pressurization mode on the overhead panel from auto to manual. But after completing the work, he forgot to switch it back to auto. The aircraft was flying at an altitude of 34,000 feet, and because the system remained in manual mode, the air pressure inside the cabin began to decrease. Under low-pressure conditions, the human brain can function properly for only about 10 minutes. This condition is called hypoxia, meaning a lack of oxygen. The first effects of hypoxia impact the brain. It can cause confusion, impaired thinking ability, and eventually unconsciousness or death. Both pilots were supposed to check this switch during their pre-flight duties, but they failed to notice it. Normally, the switch is always set to auto. They had two additional opportunities to identify the problem. One was before taxiing, and the other was after takeoff. But they missed every opportunity. When the aircraft climbed above 12,000 feet, the cabin altitude warning alarm started sounding. However, instead of recognizing it as a pressurization problem, the pilots mistook it for a takeoff configuration warning. Because of this misunderstanding, they began performing the procedure usually done on the runway before takeoff. As a result, they completely ignored the real issue. During this time, the oxygen masks had already deployed inside the cabin, and the nearby oxygen indicator lights were illuminated. But due to the early effects of hypoxia, the pilots may not have noticed them either. This was likely the moment when both the captain and the first officer lost consciousness. After about 10 minutes of oxygen supply, the passengers and cabin crew also became unconscious. Now the question arises, who was the person who entered the cockpit 2 hours later? Investigators discovered that it was flight attendant Andreas Prodromou. He possessed a commercial pilot's license, but he was not qualified to operate a Boeing 737. The cockpit voice recorder revealed that Prodromou attempted to make mayday calls after the engines failed. However, he accidentally forgot to press the transmit button. The investigation board concluded that his flying experience was insufficient to control a Boeing 737, especially in a situation where the engines had failed due to fuel exhaustion. And even if he had somehow managed to land the plane, it would have been impossible for the passengers and crew to survive. By that point, prolonged hypoxia would have caused irreversible brain damage. During the investigation, it was discovered that 3 out of the 4 portable oxygen cylinders found in the cockpit had been used. This proved that Prodromou and possibly 2 other cabin crew members had used those oxygen cylinders. That is why they remained conscious longer than the passengers and pilots. After the tragedy of Helios Flight 522, the aviation industry learned many important lessons. Several new standard operating procedures were introduced. Boeing was instructed to improve pilot training and ensure pilots understood the difference between warning alarms. Since implementing these procedures, an accident like Helios Flight 522 has never happened again. I hope you enjoy and share this scope history video. Thank you very much for your lovely comments. See you in the next great video.